Hey everyone, welcome back to another video. So as you can see, we're up at Accelerated again, and up here to finish up a few odds and ends on the Supra. But we ran into a bit of a roadblock with it that unfortunately is self-induced. So if you remember, we have this nice small brushless radiator fan. It moves a ton of air, and it has kind of a soft start technology to it where it doesn't put a whole lot of shock on the electrical system. It's just an awesome option for a radiator fan, but the issue is it's mounted backwards. So the way that it's sitting right now, it's pushing air through the front of the radiator as opposed to pulling it through. And it ends up falling on my shoulders for not doing my due diligence in researching exactly how the fan was mounted and how it's supposed to work. I went at it from the perspective of every other fan that I've used. The motor side, or the portion of it that sticks out, is the side that it flows through. And on the Spall fans, it is inverse from that. So right now it's acting as a pusher fan mounted on the engine side, which is no bueno for this cooling system. So I need to figure out if I can take this off, cut the shroud off, rotate it, do all of that, and have enough space. Right now, the point of contention with that plan is this bolt on the dry sump drive hub, although we may have the ability to sink this bolt into the hub and make it work that way. I don't know quite yet, but first thing I'm going to do here is try to swap the fan, flip it around, and see if there is enough room to do anything like that. The issue becomes all the wiring for all of that stuff is done, and it is not easily altered, if not able to be altered at all, without redoing a portion of the harness or running a sub harness, which we don't want to do with this thing. So I'll poke around at this a little bit and report back in a little while with my findings. So I went ahead and I removed the fan and inverted it on the back side of the radiator, and luckily enough it looks like everything will fit if we are able to countersink this fastener right here. At that point we still retain the hex drive on the front of the dry sump drive mandrel, just in case I ever need to get a tool on it to rotate the engine by hand. Would have the ability to do that, and just that bolt head, if it is recessed into the front of that drive mandrel, everything will fit fine without having to do anything funky with a new shroud. So still a lot of work to remake the shroud and all of that, but dodged a bullet with having to source another fan, potentially run another harness, redo more work, etc., etc. So I'll have to pull the radiator out and take that back home with me, but that's a minor inconvenience as opposed to what it could be. So now we'll go ahead and get to making that other return line off of the surge tank. And I think also today, if I can, I'd like to hook the shifter cable up, get it adjusted, and that way we'll be able to actually shift gears with this thing and not rely on climbing underneath of it with a pair of pliers or vice grips to click the transmission into gear or park or neutral or what have you. We partially solved the dry sump drive issue, and Russ was kind enough to turn this outer portion of the drive mandrel, and we countersunk the bolt down into that, so that gained us, what, at least a ½ inch right there, which is more than enough than what I need to make the new fan shroud. So beyond that, I went ahead and I got our final line made from the fuel surge tank. This is the return line from the surge to the fuel cell in the rear. We also went ahead and he showed me that we don't have a power hooked up right now, but all the switches work, the race pack turns on, all that is working very well. Up the back right here, I made the last of the fuel lines, which this feeds from the fuel cell up to the lift pump right there, and I also have my pre-filter put in place, and the wiring is ran to it as well. Pump turns on, it's very quiet, and it should flow more than enough fuel for the surge tank and everything else. So I guess what beyond that, oh, I got the transmission cable hooked up. It loops around right here, runs through the factory hole for the factory O2 sensor, and we just tested it a moment ago, at least tested park. Park works perfectly, so I'll assume the rest of the transmission works perfectly as well. So beyond that, got the last oil pan bolts in, and I can't recall what else I did when I was up here, but it was a pretty good trip. And now we'll have to go back to the shop back home and play around with that fan shroud and make it fit and make the fan sit the way that it needs to on the radiator to actually pull air through. So I may end up having to remake the upper radiator line, which is not the end of the world, and I'll just have to be cognizant right here where the fan connector is, right there, to make it so wherever I position the fan on the new shroud, it can still reach over and be connected to that point. But that's about it for the trip to Accelerated this time. So I will see you guys again in a few seconds for you, a few days for me, and we'll go ahead, work on that fan shroud, get that wrapped up and sitting the correct way, and we'll go from there. And we are back to, I guess, remedy the issues with the fan shroud and the radiator. So right here, I have the piece of aluminum that will be the new fan shroud, and I don't think that I did a very good job of explaining what the issue actually is with this. So these Spall brushless fans, the fan is essentially, it sits inverted from the way that you would normally think of an electric fan, which you guys can see from this graphic right here. But this fan sits, so the protruding portion of it, or what you would typically think of as the motor side, this is actually the leading edge of the fan, with this being a puller fan. So rather than this sticking out into the engine bay like I had it, it's this side that faces the engine bay. So the fan was backwards and acting as a pusher fan, which is not the way that I want this cooling system in this fan system to be integrated and designed for this radiator and for the cooling system on the Supra. So what we're going to do today is do some surgery on the radiator, put a new fan shroud on it, and all will be well at that point. So with the radiator right here, I will first pull all of the components out of it, these three sensors, the drain, the two 16 ORB bungs, and then we'll come along, cut this old fan shroud off, and form a new one that I'll then weld onto the radiator, and hopefully everything fits appropriately and hopefully everything works out the way that it should. So first thing to do, will be to come on here, do the drafting. We'll mark center, draw or scribe our hole, or the marking for the hole out onto it. And then I guess we can bend this up and then start the surgery on the radiator. So without rambling further, let's go ahead and get to it. The new fan shroud is built aside from 4 riv nuts, and now the time has come to do surgery on the radiator. So here's what we ended up with for our new fan shroud. And the hole fits the fan perfectly. I have all 4 of the corners welded up and all of that, but that is not the point right now. Right now, we need to come in and cut this old shroud off. So I'll need to come in and very carefully cut along each of the seams that hold this existing fan shroud to the radiator. So I pulled everything off of it. There are no more fittings, there's no more sensors, no more any of that. And I guess now comes the time to be very careful and surgically remove this old shroud from the radiator. After some very tedious precision angle grinder work, the old fan shroud is no longer attached to the radiator. So let's take a look at what the radiator looks like and see if I damaged it at all in the process. So here's what we are left with. And thankfully, I did not get into the fins or anything that would cause an issue with this thing leaking or anything along those lines. The only bit that I see is right there. I might have caught just the fins with the angle grinder a little bit, but I can straighten those fins out and all of that will be perfectly good to go. So there is still some cleanup work involved, and on all of these seams right here, I'm going to come in and re-weld those just to make sure that there aren't any leaks or anything along those lines. And then at that point, we can come in and install the new fan shroud that will sit something along those lines, and all will be well there. And the only thing that I might have to do is come and trim a little bit of the height of the fan shroud, meaning this dimension right here, as I really need the fan to sit as close to the actual gradient of the radiator as I possibly can, as we are really taxed for space with the overall thickness of this whole package. So I guess let me take a breather for a couple of minutes. That was a lot of focusing that I needed to do to get that old shroud off of there. And in a few minutes, we'll go ahead, get this other welding done, and start getting the shroud fit onto the radiator. After a solid day's worth of work, this is the end product. So this sits the fan right at the minimum distance from the radiator that it can be. As you guys remember from earlier in this video, space is at a premium under the hood in the engine bay of the Supra. So I needed to make this as compact of a package as I could, which I tried my best to do that. If this doesn't fit, then we'll have to do some more modifications to the front side of the engine. Probably that dry sump drive mandrel, modify it a bit more. But at least for the time being right now, this is what I came up with, and I'm really hoping that it fits without issue. So the shroud is welded the whole way around, aside from this corner right here, because I couldn't get my torch in there, and I did not want to interfere with that ORB bung. But that will be perfectly fine, and if it causes an issue, I can always put a little bit of epoxy or something along those lines in that corner to seal it up, to make sure that all of the air is making its way through the radiator. So I went ahead and I installed all of the fittings, all the sensors and everything else, and I may end up having to swap these out for extended number 16 ORB fittings, but we will cross that bridge when we come to it. And if you do notice that the bolts don't sit along center line, they don't sit properly, at least to the eye, on the fan shroud, but there's a reason for it. And right down here in this corner is where the wiring harness, where it resides and where that fan connection is made. And I did not want to alter that and end up having to extend wires or anything along those lines. So I was building the shroud. The easiest way to combat that was to just shift the fan to rotate it from this vantage point a little bit clockwise, and that put this harness connector right here in an advantageous location for connecting it to the pre-existing wiring, where I guess the wiring that Russ is working on the car. So really happy with how this came out, and I do like this much more than what I had going on before. Now, even though it was a little bit of an unanticipated sidetrack, unanticipated side quest rather, for this project, it was a necessity, and spacing the fan off of the radiator the way that it is now will actually make the fan and this whole system work that much more effectively. Now that the radiator and new fan shroud are completed, we're going to shift gears and just finish this video out with a little bit of welding in the DC setting on the TIG welder. And what we're going to do is take this 3.5-inch V-band and install it on the tail end of the downpipe for the SC300. So this will be an Inconel 2 stainless weld. I have a special filler rod for it over there. So I'll go ahead, pull the downpipe off, get it over on the bench, get the purge started, and we can get that wrapped up and get this video wrapped up from there. There is the finished product of the Inconel 2 stainless weld. So not bad, not my best work, not my worst, but most importantly, it is not going to break. It isn't going anywhere. So I'll go ahead and throw that back in the car. And I guess I can throw the catch can back in its place as well, as there's no reason for this thing to be disassembled any more than it has to be at this point in time. And there we have the upper passenger side corner of the Lexus engine bay reassembled. So pretty happy that now I have a V-band on the end of that downpipe, and when the time comes I can build an exhaust now based off of that V-band rather than having to do that later. And just a little task to do, but something that I had been meaning to do, and with the last plumbing parts order for AN lines and hose ends and what have you for the Supra, went ahead and ordered that V-band and was able to get it installed as you just saw. But obviously the star of today's show is still this radiator and the new fan shroud. And just wanted to make a quick note to tell you guys that always do your due diligence when working with parts that you haven't worked with before. This instance was this brushless fan for me. And don't ever just assume something. Always do your research, always do your due diligence, so that way you aren't caught in the same position that I was today, having to cut apart your work and redo it. But all in all, this ended up as a pretty good thing, and I'm really happy with the end result. And this, like I said, this shroud will work better than what we had on there before, actually being able to use the entire surface area and the entire gradient of the not the intercooler, but the radiator, as opposed to just that circle that it would have been using before with that old really tight fan shroud. So with the downpipe modified, or finished rather, for the SC300, and the radiator modified and put back together for the Supra, that's going to be about it for this episode. So as always, thank you guys very much for tuning in, watching what I do here, all these oddball projects, and my weird brainchild with the Supra. I appreciate you guys being interested in these projects the same way that I am, and as always, I hope that you find some value and maybe learn something from what I'm working on here. But with all that being said, that'll be the end of this video. So until next time, be sure to subscribe, leave a like, leave a comment, and I will see you guys in the next episode.